There we go. All right, clean up the language, boys. I think we're live. Welcome to the show. I almost said the wrong show name. This is the Smoking Ape channel. Today we're going to talk about off-center fed dipoles. A little bit of background or context. Oh God, which one of you guys has got to?
It's not me.
Yep.
It's not me.
Look at him
anymore.
He looks so guilty.
Anyhow, somebody had reached out to me a couple of different times and asked for a talk on off-center fed dipoles, and I said I would do it, and it's been a while, and I finally got around to doing it. I think originally what we were looking to do is coincide this with a potential off-center fed dipole for Cartena, and we just haven't been able to get through other stuff that we're doing there, so we haven't done it yet.
I did mention that we have one built already.
Okay, well, the cat's out of the bag.
One of us does. Okay, it's out.
And
one of us does.
Yeah,
one of the four of us has one built already.
I think some of us don't. But anyhow, so what we're going to do is we're just going to talk a little bit about off-center fed dipoles, talk about some of the myths that surround them, and some of the challenges that folks have with off-center fed dipoles, because there are a little bit of a polarizing antenna, and sometimes, as everything else in the amateur radio community, it stirs a lot of emotion. So,
like the infinite reflections that all go out the antenna.
Right. And I don't understand like why sometimes hams will get so wrapped around words if you think about it, like an antenna tuner, right? It's called a coupler, a transmatch, a tuning, a matching unit. There's so many different things that they call those. Why do we get so hung up on the language? Just understand what it does and move on.
I think it comes with the license. It's like it's in fine print on the backside. Must argue and complain about everything. Must not understand jokes or sarcasm.
Right. It's just crazy.
Speak up at all accounts. Must tell everybody their antenna's a compromise.
To Abe's point, and what Steve just said too, it's the same thing. It's like, does it work? Can you make it work a little better? Okay, we don't need to get into the weeds about the how and the why of what happens at the molecular level with the damn copper as it oxidizes in the air or something. It just...
Well, the other thing is that a lot of the stuff's actually opinion, and it's driven by group think. And whoever's the most compelling and the most emphatic is deemed by the tribe to be right. And any deviation from that opinion is seen as heresy. Cancel. Right. So anyhow, talking about off-center fed dipoles, and there'll be plenty of drama. So I think the first thing we need to do is talk a little bit about what is an off-center fed dipole. And the first dramatic thing I'm going to say is even your dipole that you painstakingly built, or one you've ordered if you're an appliance operator, is probably an off-center fed dipole, because the tolerance level that you would need to get for the actual build of that is, if you're I almost said a bad word, if you're even a fraction of a millimeter off one direction or another, you ain't in the center, right? And that's probably true of all dipoles.
I'll give you a little bit of clarification on that. One of my high school teachers taught me this. He says, if you're sitting on the couch at opposite ends from your girlfriend at the time, and every time you both move half as much closer as you were the last time, and half as much closer and half as much closer, are you ever actually going to be close enough to do anything? Yes. So that's your off-center fed dipole. You are a little tiny bit off, but it doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, it depends on how skinny she is, right? I mean,
So in late breaking newscast interruption, Dr. Fong says an NOVNA is incredibly good last night on HRCC, Mr. 8. So you know what that means. All of a sudden, people are going to start saying how great the Nano VNA is. And I've been getting grief for 3 years for saying how great it is. But that's
you should have named your channel Dr. Ape.
Yeah, that's right.
But I've never said it wasn't good. I just said it's not as easy and as fast as a rig expert.
Right.
So if you know what you're showing.
If you know what you're doing, it is. So we have the off-center fed dipole. It's a type of dipole antenna where the feed point is not at the center of the antenna. Instead, it's offset towards one end. Hopefully everybody understands the word offset. Hey, Mary. Off-center fed antennas can often operate effectively on multiple bands without the need for a tuner. And that makes them versatile for different bands. Due to their design, off-center fed antennas can be more space efficient than center fed dipoles, making them suitable for installations where space is limited. And people say, well, how is that? And the way that works is that if you have one antenna that can do multiple bands, it's more space efficient than multiple antennas to do multiple bands, if that makes sense. Now, here's the hard part, and this is where people get it wrong. And when I say people, I'm talking about antenna manufacturers as well. And everybody knows how I feel about the antenna manufacturers. Designing and tuning all center-fed dipole antennas can be more complex, comparing them to traditional center-fed dipoles. You have to be really careful when you make adjustments for these things and make sure they're balanced correctly. One of the things is that when people tune an antenna, like a dipole, they'll say, oh, my antenna is too long. I'm going to cut 2 inches off of either end. You have to have symmetry between the lengths of the sides of your off-center fed dipole. So if you're feeding it at a 1/3 point and you cut 2 inches off, you got to cut 4 inches off the other side. And when you do that kind of stuff, it makes it very easy for your antenna to be the wrong size. The other thing is it's pretty difficult to make sure that you get your feed point exact. And we're going to talk about why that's the case. Off-center fed feeding can lead to higher standing wave ratio compared to center fed dipoles, which may require additional tuning or matching networks to achieve optimal performance. They're also more prone to common mode current. And so we talk about this. When you feed a standard dipole in the center and you mount it a half wavelength off of the ground, you're going to get about 72 to 73 ohms. I actually post a question on my channel every Sunday night, and I think that was a question last week. And hey, Raphael. And what you mean by when you move that feed point from one end to the other, or closer to the center to the end, your standing wave ratio goes up because the voltage and current levels on the antenna element change when you move location. And we'll look at some graphs to show us that. Also, dipoles are prone to common mode current. All antennas are. But the more you move the feed point to the end, so even with an end fed, and I know there's a lot of famous ham tubers that say you don't need counterpoise when you feed an antenna at the end if it's a 9-to-1 versus a 49-to-1. There's no difference. When you feed an antenna at the end, you need a low impedance path to your ground or to your shield side. And if you don't have one, you're going to use your coax for that. And that's a no-no. So that problem becomes more, the common mode current problem becomes greater the more you move your feed point from the center. So for folks who don't know what a sine wave is, this is an example that I screen capped off of my oscilloscope. And the reason I wanted to show this is that you have like a voltage maximum and voltage minimum. So at the top of the sine wave is when your voltage is very high, but it's also high from a negative standpoint at the lower point. So I have markers here, AX for the high, BX for the low. When you have low voltage, that's actually at the, we'll call it the equator, the line that goes across the middle, and there's a marker number 2 that shows that. And the reason I wanted to show you this is it's going to be kind of important in some of the diagrams where we're going to talk about voltage maximum as we go through. So let's do this. This is a 66-foot dipole antenna, and we'll say it's around a 7 megahertz signal that's going in there. And let's think about that yellow, I don't know what you want to call it, half oval, half circle, whatever it is, as the top part of that sine wave going the length of our dipole. So at the center of our element, what you see is high current, low voltage. And at the ends of our antenna, what you have is high voltage, low current. So what this is a depiction of current that we see on here, not voltage. And this is kind of what we need to consider as we want to look at making an antenna multiple bands. I had to turn the space heater off. It was getting hot in here. So what I want to do is on this next slide is show that when we just discussed this, right? So if I move my feed point to the left or to the right, we get increasing impedance and we become more CMC prone. And hopefully we explain that. The reason is that at that feed point, we have a higher impedance than we do on the shield, right? And that's when we have our ground side looking for a path to ground, our ground currents looking for a path to ground. They're more likely to go down the coaxial shield than they are on the ground side of our antenna. And one of the things is like when you go through all of these documents, and we're going to look at a couple of them, talk about off-center fed dipoles, they never tell you what side should be the ground side. Is it the long side or is it the short side? Right. It's the short side
It's
is
the
the one
short
that you
side. It would have to be based on that, right?
right. And so the thing is that think about like a counterpoise on an end fed halfway, right? The counterpoise is shorter than the element. That's your ground side. So for folks who are newer, we want to talk a little bit about what makes up impedance because it's a really important part of the conversation. And we have a lot of people say, oh, I only use resonant antennas. Resonance is when there's no reactance, which is almost never. So your impedance is equal to your resistance plus your reactance. Reactance is an imaginary resistance that is dependent upon frequency. So you might have a tuned circuit that is resonant at a particular frequency, but as you drift from that frequency, you start to get what is called reactance, and it's either capacitive or inductive reactance. You add that reactance to your physical ohmic resistance. There's a formula, Z equals R plus JX, but we don't need to know all that. And when you add those together, you start to get something other than 50 ohms. And that's when your impedance goes up. Because we're moving our feed point and we want to use multiple frequencies, with an off-center fed antenna, what you really want to do is you want to find a feed point that is consistent across those bands. And then you want to predict what the impedance is going to be at that feed point. And then you want to build a transformer that will transform from 50 ohms to whatever the impedance is at the particular chosen feed point. We got pictures to show you how to do that, so it'll make it a little bit easier. Hey, Shane, what's up, buddy? I think the rest of this is okay. I don't need to go through all of that kind of stuff. The other thing I wanted to talk about, because I was throwing it out there, is common mode current. People will ham shame me for not explaining stuff and assuming that everybody has experience. So common mode current can cause interference and signal degradation. What common mode current is, it's not additional currents. It's current that is unbalanced on your feed line, typically riding on the outside of your coaxial shield. When this happens, your coaxial shield can create electromagnetic waves, which causes interference to your antenna. This current can also, because it's looking for a low impedance path to ground, come into your ham shack, and you can electrify your microphone, your radio, your hand mic, and can give you a little bit of a shock. Also, if you have things like mixers, computers, sound cards, and stuff like that connected to your radio, that common mode current can actually go into those devices looking for its path to ground and cause havoc in there, like your computer freezing up or getting shocked off of your mixer, stuff like that. So I know we're moving pretty fast and covering a lot of ground here. Did anybody have any questions about any of that stuff, impedance or common mode currents or anything that they wanted answered?
So when you're doing, for example, the Apollo, it's critical that you don't make the counterpoise as long as the element, because then you've got basically a dipole or an off-center fed dipole-ish kind of situation.
100%.
But you can put multiple radials on something like an end fed and not have that problem. Or
you can, but you want to balance it, right? Because so with a counterpoise or even a ground plane or a radio plane, whatever you want to call it, they're capacitive in nature. So when you add those, you're adding capacitance, which means that on your Smith chart, you're going to be going down into the lower hemisphere.
Bottom half, yeah.
Right. And then you're going to be moving further and further away from resonance. So ideally, like if you look at the Smith chart, you want to be anywhere on that equator because you're resonant at that point. And then you want your matching network to do an impedance transformation down to whatever your transmission line is to reduce your SWR. And so adding more capacitance can be a problem because you're going to be off balance. The other thing is a lot of people are like, well, I'd use my antenna just fine with no counterpoise. I use my coaxial. Well, the coaxial ground is different than a counterpoise or from a ground plane because the counterpoise or ground plane, like I said, is capacitive in nature. The coaxial shield is actually a path to earth ground. That's what it's looking for, which is actually resistive in nature. So when you send current down your coaxial shield and it's looking for its path to ground, it's gone. When you send it into a capacitor, we all know capacitors fill with energy and then they drain with energy. And that helps your positive side or your hot side or your center conductor side of your antenna because the current's working against each other. You lose that with earth grounding. So it's kind of a little important distinction there. Not all ground is the same.
Yeah, true. We have a couple questions if you want to deal with any of them, or we can
Let's
move
do it.
on.
Let's do it.
All right. James Roberts is asking, does he need CMC protection on his loop, or does he have CMC on his loop?
You know, I've got
You
no
don't
idea.
need CMC. No one needs CMC, I think.
Right. I wouldn't add a counterpoise to a loop, and I wouldn't add a ground plane. A loops work
I
off
think
of
he's
the
talking common mode
magnetic
choke,
part.
right?
Yeah. They work off of, well, he's talking about common mode current, I would assume.
I think he's talking about choke.
Well, I would definitely put
Just
a choke
saying.
on it just because I
Yes.
choke everything. But the thing is that mag loops work off of electromagnetic radiation, just like your antenna, but they work more on the magnetic side than the traditional antenna. So I don't really play around. When you're talking about loop antenna, I'm assuming you're talking about a mag loop and not like a delta loop or a sky loop or something like that. If I was using like a delta loop or a sky loop, I would 100% be concerned about putting a common mode current choke on there. But I would do the same thing on a mag loop because I even choke my Raspberry Pi, if that makes sense.
Jason is asking about CMC existing only on transmit or receive as well.
It's a problem on transmit. You can pick up your coaxial cable can act as a incidental radiator, I guess is the right word, like as an antenna on receive, but receive signals are significantly diminished compared to a transmit signal in terms of power, that you really only worry about it on transmit.
Yeah.
He said it. He was talking choke is what James said.
Okay.
He answered it. It's for a mag loop. I'd still run one.
Wiley's saying the center of the dipole is at high current, low voltage. What happens if the signal at the end of the coax at the antenna arrives at a high voltage, low current due to length?
What happens if the signal at the end of the coax at the antenna
end of the coax?
Well, that's the center of a dipole, right? Is where the coax goes in.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Wiley. I'm not sure 100% understand what you're asking.
We need Hollywood for that.
Well, I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but Hollywood is awesome. Is a
he's our backup.
He sure is.
He's our Encyclopedia Galactica.
With either the middle or where everything comes together.
So we're going to talk about this later on, Raphael. He's talking about an off-center fed is something that confuses him. It's not balanced. It is not. He says our VK Guru says voltage balance should not be used, but most OCFDs I see use Ruthall style voltage balun instead of Guinella current ones. And so I think the general consensus these days is that you should be using what they call a hybrid balun, which includes a 4-to-1 Ruthall style voltage balun, and I don't like to use the word balun there, and then a Guinella current balun behind it. Now, the thing is that I would think that you would want to use an unun versus a balun because you're going from unbalanced feed line to an unbalanced antenna. And this is one of the things that makes the off-center fed dipole dramatic, and people get upset and say, well, this antenna is no good. And even the manufacturers will put a balun in there instead of an unun. And I think that that's probably, a slight technical distinction that you should, and we're going to look at pictures of the schematics between the two. But personally, if I was going to build and then even market an off-center fed dipole antenna, I would use a 4-to-1 Ruthall style voltage unun, and then I would have that feed into a 1-to-1 Guinella current balun. Whew. All right, makes sense. And Raphael's a pretty smart guy. He's the engineering type.
Yeah.
Should it be perpendicular to the radiator? And I'm assuming he means his coaxial. And you want that to come straight down. And I think that we're going to look at some data around that because
pictures.
Yeah, if you have your coaxial cable coming off at an angle as opposed to being perpendicular to the top part of your antenna, you run the risk of interference, and interference is bad. All right, I think we got it.
Yeah, we're caught up on.
I see Tim in the chat. Tim, I saw your email and I owe you a reply. I didn't forget about you. And I see our boy John Gendron in there. And I
Oh,
saw your
scroll up,
email and I got to
Jim. There we
reply to
go.
it. Oh, you one too.
I'm sorry. This is what Shane was talking about. I missed this one.
So
Yeah.
I don't stake mine to the ground.
I don't
I just lay it across the ground. And what I would tell you is lay it in a direction that's convenient for you. The direction or orientation of your counterpoise will affect your far field plot and your radiation pattern. But if you're using antennas like like end-fed half waves, end-fed random wire, your radiation pattern is going to be wildly unpredictable based off of frequency, just given the nature of multi-banded antennas. And so, as Jim would say, go with God.
Yeah.
If you have to bend it a little bit because you don't have space, just bend it.
Yeah, just get it on the ground.
Just use it.
Because
if you have problems, then
you're
mess with it.
capacitively coupling that, right? So any
Yeah.
issue you're going to have is going to be just based on your dirt, honestly. You know, are you dry? Are you high mineral content, or is it rocky? Or, you know, there's just.
Well, see, like I've got a fence that has wire mesh on it, and I mount my end-fed close to the fence. So my counterpoise runs parallel to the fence in close proximity to that wire mesh, which I am sure interacts.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I had a problem, I'd point in another direction. But fortunately
Right.
for me, that helps out. All right. So what we John's saying, most of the commercial feed points for off-center fed use a hybrid 4-to-1 voltage unnun and current balun. You know, I would love to agree with you, but I've seen quite a few that actually use the 4-to-1 voltage balun and a current balun. And even some of the gurus, and I think I've got an example or two, use the word balun. Now, it could be a lexicon thing where they're using the words balun and unnun interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we have a picture. And when we look at that, we'll see that it is actually a balun in one of these things. So what I did here is we had the yellow half bubble, we'll call it that, which depicted the current relationship as it moves up and down our antenna on 40 meters with these green ones. I don't get any ideas here, Jim. These green ones are 20 meters. So you can see that our current distribution changes with frequency. And when we have one of these off-center fed dipoles, remember I talked about we wanted to find a common impedance level between the frequencies that we use. And so why this is important to understand, or important distinction to make, is that off-center fed dipoles are not harmonic dipoles like an end-fed half wave, which is a little bit of a goofy concept to think about, because the 15 meters is a third harmonic of 70, but you won't find a common feed point on this antenna with similar impedance levels until you get to the end. So at that point, it becomes an end-fed dipole, not a off-center fed dipole. So the off-center fed dipole works on current distribution, not harmonic relationships between frequencies, if that makes sense. Hacks, I agree with you, but I don't know what the context is.
Well, no, when he's talking about it, that way he doesn't get yelled at by the unnun/balun Nazis about, you know, using the correct term.
Yeah, well, so you can use a transformer, but the thing is that earlier I complained about people who want precision in their lexicon.
An unnun is not a transformer.
Well, an unnun is not a balun, and a balun is not an unnun. So there's a little bit of there's a difference there.
Oh yeah, there's a difference, but a balun is doing more transformation because you're going from a balanced to an unbalanced, right? Or vice versa.
Yep.
An unnun is an unbalanced to an unbalanced. So it's not really transformation.
It's a voltage transformation. So Les over here is telling us that DJ0IP is the place to go, and we're going to look at some of his materials. So I did my homework. Now here's where we add 10 meters into the equation, right? So we had 40 meters, then we went and looked at 20 meters, and now we look at 10 meters. And so what we do is we get with 40 meters, we have one current maximum. And then with 20 meters, we had 2. And then with 10 meters, we now have 4. And so we still have to find this part of the antenna that has the predicted impedance that we want. The reason we do that is because with the predicted impedance, we can make a transformer that will take that particular impedance and then match it, and then we can use this antenna without a tuner. If you want to use the antenna with a tuner, it becomes less important to be as precise. So this is the mark, right, where we have the most predictable impedance point. I think in my next slide, it makes it a little bit more clear, but that's where we want to look. So any deviation, and I'm talking a % or 2 of the overall length of the antenna in either direction, is going to mess with this. So you can see right here, that's where all of those different impedance coalesce. And different antenna manufacturers, different ham gurus will all argue that this is 25% on one side, 75 on the other, and then every ratio in between all the way up to around 40 and 60%. They all can't be right? So there has to be one, there has to be a magic number. And that's typically derived by, testing, experimentation, and measuring and taking this antenna up and down a million times to get it exactly right.
That's the worst.
It is. It makes it so much harder than with like an end fed, because you can actually put your end fed up like in a sloper configuration. All you have to do is disconnect your transformer and snip the wire at the transformer feed point, right? It makes it so much easier to tune.
Yep.
Putting and taking up one of these is difficult, because one of the challenges that you have with dipole antennas, especially multi-banded antennas, is that they're referenced to ground, how high they are up in the air. So if I have my antenna up 33 feet, and then I bring it down to make an adjustment, and I put it back up, and I only get it up 32 feet, my adjustment's not going to be consistent between measurements, right? So there's a whole lot of poke and hope and praying in here, where you are hoping that you get it right with each time that you put it up. The other thing is that if you mount your antenna as an inverted V, which is a very common thing for folks to do as well, the pitch of that V has to be consistent between measurements, or otherwise your testing's invalid. Yeah, it would not resonate at 15 as a regular dipole. Now, what you can do is that you can, I don't think you can see my mouse, but as you move along here, you can pick a different feed point, and then you can get an approximation of a consistent impedance level, and then you can use your unun to do the transformation, and then a tuner, like a 3-to-1 inside your 7300, for example, the most popular selling HF radio of all time, to get it touched up to match. But it's not going to give you the ability to go tuner free with a 1-to-1. And in reality, you're probably best you're going to get around a 1.5 to 1 on one of these antennas anyway. So I think I covered the slide. The question is where do we want to feed this? What's the impedance? And then what transformer do we actually want to use on this thing? So we talked a little bit about the differences between baluns versus unun. So I wanted to throw these schematics in here. The one on the left is a balun, and the one on the right is an unun. These are both 4-to-1, which means that you have a certain number of bifollar windings center tapped on your toroid. I suppose you could use a solenoid like a bar or something like that, but they're a little more lossy. So it's generally accepted that you would use a toroid to do this type of work. Now, what you can see on the one on the left is the center tap from the toroid is connected to the shield side of our unbalanced transmission line. On the one on the right, the center tap is connected to the center conductor of our unbalanced line. That's the difference between an unun and a balun. And it doesn't seem like it makes a big difference, and I'm not even 100% sure that I could explain in a way that's understandable the difference between the two. But what we use for like our Poseidon antenna, for example, is an unun, because it's an unbalanced antenna. The reason it's an unbalanced antenna is we don't have symmetry between our hot side and our ground side, the same way you don't have symmetry on an off-center fed dipole.
I haven't had symmetry since 1981.
Right. I'm not sure I have either.
I'm off center fed.
Yeah. Any questions about any of that?
I don't know that we got any queued up. We did have one. Ham Bandit made an interesting comment, and I never thought about that, but that's a damn fine idea right there.
If your coax is buried in the ground more than 10 feet, the CMC would be gone after about 15 feet.
10 feet.
10 feet deep.
That's
a lot of work.
That's a lot of digging, son.
I just choke it.
I'm
Better
I think
tired.
he's
ditch switch
talking
for
about. I think
that.
he's talking about the length, not the depth.
Well,
Right,
no,
so
you can't have more than 15 foot of coax that's only 10 feet long.
And
That's true.
and Jim's going to find this out, that 18 feet is the magic number for coax. He's going to find this out soon.
Oh yeah, because he's getting into that CB range. Yep.
That's right.
So-
18
Yep.
feet.
18 feet.
No more, no
Oh,
less.
man.
So, for example, my DX Commander is on about 125 feet of coax, but it's all underground. Almost all of it's underground the
Yeah,
whole
but only a
way.
few inches.
Yes,
Yeah, I
because
don't
it made me
know.
tired digging all that.
I
I
can't believe
know.
he
I did it
it.
to mine.
I have no idea about bearing
Took him 2
coax
weeks,
and
Chuck.
its impact on attenuation of current on the shield. I really don't. So that would be the first time I've heard that. I'm not disputing it. I'm just saying I would require further explanation.
He said length.
See,
Length
I was right.
underground. Several people. Yeah.
Todd's already built one.
10 foot deep,
For the
15
show.
foot long, no more common mode.
Right.
I don't know if you're joking, Todd, or not, but that's awesome if you did, and it's awesome
Think
if you're
so.
joking too, I guess. And thank you very much for the super chat. All right, let's see what we have here. So we're going to take a look at some resources that I pulled together,
Resources.
and these are all linked
Hello, Duncan.
in the description if you want to do further, because I'm not sure how much we're going to go into each one of these, just given time constraints. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share,
I actually
and
did build one.
when I share this, I can't see anything. So I'm going to rely on you boys to look at the comments for me. So this radio club here, the RSARS, and I think they're British. We're not going to hold that against them, but that's not a British call sign, so I don't know. But it is a British website. And it says Mississauga Amateur Radio Club in Ontario, Canada. So it leads me to believe that they're Canadians, and we're not going to hold that against them either. But this newsletter that they put out called The Communicator, in part 3, they talk about multiband antennas, and they talk a little bit about Windoms and off-center fed dipoles. And our friend Eddie Spignola is the one who penned this article. So thank you, Eddie. And I think the first thing here in this diagram we're looking at is a difference between the Windom and the off-center fed. And a lot of people will confuse these two antennas, which is a common thing to happen, but it's not a good thing to happen because they're not the same. So if you take a look at this Windom, you can see that instead of a coax going up the center, it's actually single wire feed. So they have a termination at the ground. The single wire goes up, and then they have a split of that single wire that they're feeding off center. And so with an off center fed dipole, typically what you do is your wire feed that is going up there is actually coaxial transmission line. Now, in some cases, people will use like a 450 ohm ladder line for that, but I believe that introduces some complexity as well. And then here they have about 47 feet to 130 feet. Now, I'm not going to read all these words because I don't like reading. And they talk a little bit about some background of how we got to the Windom antenna and how that turned into the off-center fed. And then they talk about the development of the Windom antenna. And here it says the off-center fed antenna to become known as the Windom antenna was described by Lauren Windom. So that's where it gets the name. And I think that there is a little bit of debates. A lot of people were saying because they also call these a Carolina Windom. And I think people have said it's a regional thing is why it's called a Windom.
Only works in Carolina, yeah.
Yeah. And so over where you hear some crazy stuff, right? On this side says for a half wavelength dipole, the resistive component at the center of the antenna is considered to be 72 ohms when the antenna is in free space. I think you become free space kinda at a half wavelength above ground. The input impedance at any point along its length can be calculated, knowing the input impedance at its center. That means you need to do math. When an antenna is very thin, the current distribution along its length is essentially cosinusoidal, as shown in Figure 2.
That is
And so that
impressive.
means that you apply a cosine in your equation to predict what your impedance is going to be along the length of this. They go into some antenna theory. We're not going to do that. And then he talks about harmonic operation, and he says off-center fed antennas have an advantage over balanced center-fed dipoles because an off-center fed will also resonate on approximately even order harmonics. But that's not really entirely true. because you have to get your feed point. So it's really more about impedance matching than it is a length of a radiator being a harmonic measurement of a fundamental frequency. I think I talked about that a little bit earlier. And then he goes into some egg-headed explanations for this kind of stuff. He talks about, he says, there are many variations of the Carolina Windom. However, the overall ratio of 37.8 to 62, so he's saying that right here, to the feed point. And this is on a 10 through 80 meter band with the use of a tuner. And so they have some measurements here, and you can see it says 4-to-1 balun, which you would use a balun if you were using balanced antenna. This is an unbalanced antenna. He does talk about a tuner, and we talked about earlier in one of the slides that if we didn't have consistent feed point from an impedance standpoint, we would need to use the touch-up tuner. Down here, they talk about a shortened version of the Carolina Windom, which covers 10 through 40 meter bands. And that's, I don't know about y'all, but if I put up an antenna, it's probably going to be the shortened version, right? It's going to be 40 through 10. That's why in even the slides earlier, I didn't use that in the description. I just don't have the space for an 80 meter dipole. If you do, God bless you. That's awesome.
Right.
Hey, Mary,
Did you
she's
borrow the
saying
neighbor's
that,
cornfield?
Thump has a question.
hold on a second. I just want to, Mary saying that that's her club in Mississauga.
Yeah, she called you out on that.
She
Yeah.
sure did.
Nice.
So
I think we can assume Mary's
guess they're not
Canadian,
in
and
the
you
UK.
probably offended her.
well, maybe we can get Eddie
Mississippi.
Spignoli on the show.
She said
To
Mississippi.
come on here and explain. We'd love to have him on if you could make that happen. And then what were you saying? Thump has a question.
Spignoli. Thumpster has a
I heard that
question.
wrong.
He said on the Windom, it says to use a single wire to feed it. Wouldn't that single wire resonate?
I think it would. And so that what you're doing with the Windom, as far as I understand it, you're using that single wire as your primary resonator, and then the wire across the top is more of a capacitance head, as opposed to like a radial network at the bottom. But yes, it would resonate. Figure 4 it says Carolina Windom. Maybe they're making the distinction between a Windom and a Carolina Windom. Is a Carolina Windom being fed with coax for 80 to 10, and in here it looks like they're using a line isolator. And so what I assume that is going to do is help with your common mode current. He says to use 10 feet of RG58. Typically what I do is I put my balun, my 1-to-1 balun choke right at the feed point, right after the 4-to-1 unun. And so what I really liked about this article, and this is one of the ones that I did start reading initially, is that they're not using a 4-to-1. So when they talk here, they're using, it's labeled a 4-to-1, but it's really like 3 point. Oh, here it is. The feed point impedance is 120 to 140 ohms and requires a 2.8 to 1 balun. And they cite an article for this from ARRL, and I did not share the ARRL article because I didn't want to get in trouble for attribution type things. Generally speaking, they never get upset about stuff like that, but the document that I had said do not reuse, so I didn't want to share it.
Classified.
Right. So what they're showing here on this 4-to-1 is the balun and the choke, and this is a 4-to-1. You see a 200 ohm expected output and then a 50 ohm expected input. But in the document, what they talk about is a 2.8 to 1, which would be like 120 to 140 ohms. And then down here, there's other trickery that people do because they want to be able to get more bands and wider bandwidth on each one of those bands. And so they talk about the ultimate off-center fed dipole by Serge, ON4AA, and I guess ON4. That's like a Swede, right? That's a Swedish call.
It's European for
Switzerland.
sure. Switzerland, Sweden, somewhere in there.
And so in here, they have it at around 26% of the length is offset, and that says a 200 to 50 ohms, so it's a 4-to-1 balun. And then it's a 50.
Can you make that picture bigger?
What is it? It's Control Plus, right?
Payback here.
Yeah, Control Plus.
Right.
Payback.
That's absolutely right.
Jim's been waiting to do this forever.
That was never in my mind.
Right.
But what you can see is the 50% mark. They do a little trickery with a capacitor and an inductor, and that would help adjust, and I would assume choke off certain frequencies if you wanted to get things like 6-meter band or something like that. But I didn't commit all that stuff to memory, so I don't know.
That seems like an extra special amount of work there.
Yep. And then this is this person's off center fed, and it shows your sweep here. You can see he's a little over 1.5 at 80, 2 to 1 on 40. But he does have 30 meters in there, right? Which is
That looks
something
like a rig expert sweep also.
no, that's
Yeah.
not. And then here we have 20. See, for me, this is problematic, right? Because I have a 2 to 1 on 20 and 40, essentially. 15 is, it looks fantastic on this thing. And then 10 is pretty narrow. But again, all these are below 3 to 1. So with your touch-up tuner, as they suggested, you would be fine. So here's ham radio secrets, and this is another pretty good article on off-center fed dipoles. And I think the reason I talked a little bit earlier about some of the drama, some of the confusion, and some of the actual people are like, I don't like off-center fed dipoles. You can see we've already looked at a lot of different opinions as the right way to skin this cat. Keep in mind, with an antenna manufacturer, and I'm not hating on them, but maybe a little bit, they are looking for the cheapest way to manufacture an antenna that will get you as close as they can on certain frequencies. And the goal for them is to separate you from your money. Things like these websites that we're looking at, these club sites, what they're doing is saying, hey, we want to build an antenna that's going to work well. And they're trying to educate. And so that's where some of the balance between what's going to actually work well and then what is a marketable product enter into the equation.
Look at this hardcore dude right here. Mike
Can't see
is
what
Mike.
an 80-meter off-center fed in a park for POTA.
He's legit.
It's tough. It is tough.
Well, yeah,
That's
not telling you he
hardcore.
took the 80 meter and used it as a seating cushion so he could use his vertical.
He's legit, that guy.
Hardcore.
So this is from Ham Radio Secrets, and he says he likes the off-center fed dipole because it performs quite well on most of the amateur radio frequency bands if you're not afraid to stray away from the traditional way of doing things. And he goes into some of the conversation around sometimes it's falsely referred to as a Windom antenna, and he goes into the Windom is a single wire fed antenna which works against ground, and he goes into all of this stuff.
He also mentioned that that top hat was capacitance on that.
Yeah. And so here we
that
talk
thing.
about the harsh reality, and they're using an 80-meter half-wave dipole, and they talk about the current maximum at point A, and I think we've covered that. But then when you start to look at these different feed points at 20%, 25%, and 33%, they are different, and they work well for different frequencies. And that's why I was talking about you want to get that consistent feed point impedance. And he talks about how impedance increases the further either direction you move from the center. And you might want to take a look at this because you can see here is the distribution for 40 meters on an 80-meter half-wave dipole. Now for mine, I just folded the two up to make it a little bit easier to read. But what they're saying here is that for a 40-meter, 25% is the magic number, right? But that's different than what it was for 80, right? For 80, right here is the magic number at 50. And down here at 20, he looks at it at 20%. He says works very well for 20 meters. And then if you throw 15 in the mix, I think you're back at 25. So that's where it gets confusing, is really choosing where you want. And for 10, he's looking at 33%, or down here at 20. That's where it gets very confusing as the bands that you want, and then the predictability that you want for no tuner operation, it starts to get very complex. And then here would be 30 meters. And he's even got 17 in here. And see, at 17, the 20% is useless due to 0. So like if you had a 4 to 1 mounted at 20% because you wanted to use that for 30 meters at 17 meters, you would have a 4 to 1 impedance. And then here's 12. So I'm not going to belabor this too much, but what you can do is you can come here and check it out and read more about it. And maybe I'll watch your video after you do that. But what he's saying is preliminary conclusion is that a 33% off point feed point will not allow the use of an 80 on 30 and 15. And that's where I was talking about 15 being considered one of the harmonics. It's not going to work if you feed it there. The 25% offset feed point will not allow the use of 80 on 20 and 10 for the same reason. The 20% offset feed point will not allow the use of 80 on 17 due to lack of current. Here he goes into a little bit around balun or unun, and he agrees that a off-center fed dipole is inherently an unbalanced antenna. Therefore, using a balun is a popular misconception rather than common sense. An unun at the off-center fed feed point would be much more appropriate for those who absolutely insist on using lossy transmission line with an antenna. And that's what we probably do, right? We use coax. And so he makes a case down here for a 9-to-1 at the transceiver end of a 450 ohm transmission line. And to me, that seems like an off-center fed doublet, not an off-center fed dipole. But what do I know?
Off-center fed doublet. That's going to be interesting.
Right. And I think that would require a little bit more maths in here to get all that stuff right.
Cornbread made a interesting comment, Abe.
He always does.
Well, this one was legitimate and didn't involve anything sketchy. So he said
Like
off center. What comment, Chuck? We didn't see it. It was
That's right.
That's right. Off center fed dipoles work, but it's harder to run higher power. And he apparently doesn't like punctuation. You can, but it's harder to keep your standard wave ratios in line.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that you notice is that sometimes your SWR will change with power level. People say, well, that shouldn't happen, right? Because a ratio is a ratio, and the ratio should be the same between low power and high power. But sometimes the more power that you apply, the greater reflection that you get. But also one of the reasons that, and I just got into a huge argument with somebody that I almost decided to delete their comments, but I didn't. And what they were saying is that when you have common mode current on your feed line, that common mode current goes into your SWR meter, which is, we use voltage SWR meters. Now I know that there's one guy somewhere that's going to watch this that uses a current SWR meter, but we use voltage SWR meters.
We know
that common mode current is a voltage that will be detected by your SWR meter and will make your SWR look different than what it really is because it's including common mode current in the calculation. So what could be happening, Cornbread, is that as you go up in power, because you're not choking, because you should always be choking and you're probably not, that you are going to get common mode currents that are going to come in and fudge with your SWR measurement. Whew. All right. So we also took a look at the Loudon Amateur Radio Group. I guess this is LARG, is what they would call themselves.
I wouldn't say large, no.
Probably.
Right. LARG.
That sounds like something you scrape off the floor of the theater.
It sounds like something that you would use to make your scrapple on the griddle, right?
Like I
Give
said.
me a scoop of LARG. Right. So what they talk about here is, this is another 80 meter one, 83 feet and 2.5 inches, 46 feet and 9.5 inches, and a 4-to-1 balun. What they don't have depicted here, and I'm not making fun of them, is they don't show their common mode current choke. Shame, shame, shame. But then they say this antenna is very popular design. Its performance is very good and requires little to no tuning. The off-center fed dipole is fed with a 4-to-1 balun, should be an unun. At the offset point, the antenna shows 80, 40, 20, and 10 meters. And the formula can be used to adjust the overall length to cover more or fewer bands. And that's true. So down here, they talk a little bit about design parameters. And they said that divide the half wavelength standard of 486 by the lowest operating frequency to get your overall length. And they have a standard dipole, but instead of dividing the result in half, use 36 to 64 offset to determine the feed point. And again, one of the things so far of all these we've seen, they never reference which side, and I mentioned it earlier, should be the short leg. Is it the ground or is it the pin? I think it's the ground.
I would agree. But
so if we take a look at this box, this is a 4-to-1 balun built from spare parts around the shack. You can see the center tap right here is going to the shield. So that is legitimately a balun and not an unun. And then they come down here and they show a nice little schematic here. And then you can see the center tap is this blue and red coming down, and that goes to the shield. So I don't understand why they're advocating the balun over the unun, to be honest with you. maybe that they think that this will deal with common mode current as well. But the thing is that if you have a single core 4-to-1 balun like this, you're asking it to do two jobs: one, to suppress common mode current, and two, to do an impedance transformation. And I don't think that's a good idea. I would want to go with a
Separate.
multiple core system.
Yeah.
Now, there's a problem with multiple core systems. And they got this guy down here, George, over from George's Workbench, and he doesn't look like he knows what he's doing. I'm not making fun. Looks like a traditional ham, and that ham shack has a lot of stuff in an unorganized fashion. So I would
this
say
guy must be, he's legit. I mean, look at all them parts on the left side, and then I see wires and meters and stuff.
Screwdrivers everywhere. Yeah,
right.
I mean,
looks like my shop.
I was gonna say, it looks like a younger version of Jim. And there's an older version of Jim.
So here we have Ricky, I believe is
I call
his name.
that Chuck.
Ricky.
And this is right, DJ0IP. And this guy's really bright guy. And when they were mentioning him earlier on. And I really enjoy his blog, I guess is the right way to put it. But what he talks about using is this thing he calls the mother of all baluns, or the super all center fed dipole hybrid balun. And his design's been copied by a lot of people, Palomar Engineering to be one of them, I believe. And he's talking about 750 watts, so 3/4 of a gallon. And when he built this thing, one of the sweeps that he did, and this is a VNA sweep, is that this blue line is the resistance, and you can see that it's close to 50 all the way down to when you start to get around. I don't know. That's probably around 10 meters. This is probably 6 meters. This is probably 10 meters. This is 12. And then down here, you can see the red line. This is SWR. But essentially what he's doing for this mother of all balun is using two stacked FT240 61s. And they use these 61s because they deal with heat better. And so they're less likely to become saturated. And he uses those strictly for voltage or impedance transformation. And then he follows that up by two FT 240 31s wrapped with RG400 coax and a Guanella current 1-to-1 balance. He's got two of them on here. Now, one thing I'll say about a balun like this is that this is 4 cores, and these cores are heavy. And then if you're going to take these cores and you're going to stick them in a box, good luck mounting that as a flat top dipole, unless you have a mount point specifically for this, like a master hanging it from a tree.
Yeah,
it's going to be heavy.
Yeah. And then so here is the schematic that he uses, and then he talks about it's made up of multiple 4-to-1 Ruth off and a 1-to-1 choke. Sticks it in some PVC, and it's 3 pounds 3 ounces.
Jeez,
and
that's a chunky boy.
That's some weight there. The last thing is that he talks a little bit about all center fed dipoles and the dilemma really of where you want to get this point B. And he's got one that he claims is like almost every single band, and he's got a magic balun in there and all this other stuff. But here he talks a little bit about we must realize that they're all not created equal. There's significant differences in their performance, primarily caused by the difference in their balun, resulting in common mode problems. And common mode current typically causes a multitude of problems. And I'm probably not going to go into all that. I guess we can if we have time. But when he talks about common mode current and some of the problems, like this is a good installation, right? It's a nice little happy installation. Over here, and I think Shane was asking about the orientation of the coaxial cable, and that can cause problems because of interaction with your radiator. And then like also, what's not good is having this thing go over top something that's conductive, like your shed or your rusted out El Camino or your boat.
Hey man, don't talk about my El Camino.
I was gonna say, I think you just outed Joe Brett in like 3 different ways there.
Yeah, all of the above.
Right. Let's see what happens here. And then here it talks a little bit about common mode current. So what I would suggest is you go check out these links, and that might help you out a little bit. I'm going to hit stop sharing. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to add this back to the stage. And so I think if I was going to build one of these today, what we would look to do we would get about 66 feet of wire. And he says that outed most of the people in the state of Mississippi.
Right.
But I think what I would do is I would look at about 66 feet of stranded copper wire, and I would probably mount it in an inverted V, a very wide pitched inverted V, about 32 feet high. And the challenge is that the height is going to make a difference depending upon which band we're operating on. And what I would hope to get out of that is a very clean 40, 20, and 10, possibly 15. And then with a tuner, I could probably get 30, 12, maybe 17. And what I would use is a 4-to-1 voltage unun, Ruthoff design, and then I would use an FT240 or a 140 mixed 61 core. Yeah, and then I would use a 1-to-1. What's that?
For the heat specifically, or for?
I would, and it seems that most of the stuff recommends the 61 for that, so I would start with that. And if I had problems, I would look at changing it. If I didn't, I wouldn't mess with it. For common mode current, I would look at a 1-to-1 current, Guanella current balun, and I'd probably use I would use a mix 31 240, or I would use a probably 140-43. I did get my hands on some 140 31s, and that was a very difficult thing to do. But I have not tested those out. And I would look at around a 36 to 64% offset, and then I would make adjustments from there if necessary. Now's the time where everybody tells me how I'm wrong.
You're wrong.
You're wrong.
You're
Jeff
wrong.
has
Jeff
a
said
El Rancho.
it's a Ranchero, not an El Camino.
A ranchero.
Yeah, if you had one, you're gonna be getting raunchy at the drive-in. I'm just saying.
Yeah,
When he says
really
a Ranchero, I was thinking
you
like
don't wanna say
dipping.
it.
I was thinking dipping sauce for like a jalapeno popper.
Sounds
Okay.
good too.
Yeah.
Ranchero sauce.
Chevy El Camino and Ford Ranchero. El Camino, I love it. It literally stands for the road.
The road.
We named our car the road.
We were watching
It's like naming our
something-
plane the car.
Julie and I were watching something on TV yesterday. I don't even remember what it was. And they had this guy on there that I swear to God, I thought of Izzo in an El Camino about 74, 76, somewhere in that year time frame, with the mullet, Freebird on the 8-track, driving to his weed farm. I said, yeah, that guy. And I'm picking on Izzo because I know he had an El Camino, or there's a rumor he was an El Camino guy, but
Yeah, my uncle when I was a kid had a blue Stardust El Camino. Thing was beautiful, and I wanted that car bad. It had chrome all the way around all of the.
Your
all the
mullet.
highway.
let your mullet flow with the windows down.
Yeah, that
The
thing was sweet.
The 75s, I think that was the year you can like put huge rear tires in those things, and they fit inside. It's just the way that body was built on that thing.
I like that 4.5. The way is better than the road as the name of a car.
Yeah. I think that's wrapping it up. Does anybody have any questions about any of this stuff, or what?
I think we covered,
I thought we were going to use this one here.
most of the, we
Let's
covered
see
all
what
the ones I had starred.
I'm asking the important questions.
Haven't used this on anything yet.
That's a 2-to-1, right?
Yeah.
Is it
We were talking
2.8 to 1?
2.8. It's not. It's 2-to-1. This is it's tunable by this blue wire.
So Thump's asking the hard question: are we going to have an off-center fed dipole as part of Cartena? And let me just get everybody back on the stage. The right way to do it. I think the answer is that we don't know, right? And part of the challenge is that we support our antennas. So if somebody has a problem building the kit and they call us, we say, hey, well, what are you seeing? What are you doing? Can you send us pictures? And it becomes and we like doing it, but it's a very time consuming thing. And just given everything that we went through, there's some inherent complexities around building an off center fed dipole.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And if somebody calls us and says, hey, mine won't tune, or mine's not resonant or anything like that, we don't have an easy way of saying how long are the legs of this thing unless they actually show us how they measured them. Right. Which is a lot to ask for. And just being 100% candid, I don't know if I want to support it. Right. And the thing is that we could sell a kit and say, hey, this is unsupported, but I don't think that's right either, to be honest with you.
No.
So the answer is that I don't know. Thanks,
Well,
Andrew.
and to Abe's point, and he makes an excellent point here. First of all, the support process is entirely manual. Like
Right.
email us, and then one of us answers the email or forwards the email to the appropriate answerer here in our little group.
Right.
But I mean, like Abe's talking about with pictures and everything, we can see. Like with the Poseidon, we've answered several questions on the Poseidon. You wrap the toroid wrong. You cross the wire. I mean, there's only 2 or 3
Did
things you
videos.
can. Yeah, there's only 2 or 3 things you can do that will mess up a Poseidon antenna, or any of the others. Honestly, I've not built the Mercury, so I can't answer that one. But we can look at a few pictures and troubleshoot right away. But with something like this, it's like, were you actually using a metric tape measure or an imperial tape measure?
Yeah, was it a sag in there? So, and
I
the
mean,
thing
there's
is that
so many
like
variables.
again,
Right.
being candid, our kits are really aimed towards people who are starting out building antenna kits, right? So folks will contact us and say, "Hey, this is the first kit I ever built. I loved it. It went great." And that's awesome. I don't think an all center fed dipole is a beginner build. I just don't, right? Because the all the stuff that we just talked about that went in there. And to be candid, if you can sit down and hammer out an off center fed dipole, you probably don't need a kit. You know what I mean? Like that's probably something that you could that you have already experienced builder, you already have parts, you already have toroids, you already have tools, you've already got experience building, and you probably don't need a kit. Now, does that mean we'll never sell one? No.
See you,
It just
John.
means that I don't
See
think
you,
the
John.
times is right now.
So
Well, the difference in a kit is we gather all the right parts for you. Basic is,
Right.
is what our kit is, and you don't have to buy 10 of one or 2 or 3 different things just to get the one you need.
Right.
We do that part, so that's the difference in a kit, basically. Yeah, you can build all these, and you'd have the extra parts laying over, and probably do it for about the same price.
and Craig, the answer
But
to
you won't have
pre-cut
the winder.
legs
That's the
is
part.
Chuck's old fingers. He can't do all that.
Right.
That's why we went from, because Chuck, when we initially
Parts,
started,
parts.
Chuck was cutting the wire.
Right.
And we were
Yeah,
sending
we
you a
don't
specific
do
length
that
of
no
wire.
more.
But that takes a lot of time. And then there's a more important issue involved with this. Put that
Now,
comment
that
back up on the screen.
Right. Mrs.
one?
Katie Thompson.
Mrs. Thompson.
There, I'll let you get it.
Chuck is skating on thin ice just pretty much every day with all the ham crap that's in her way.
Let alone
So-
all the other stuff that Chuck is skating on thin ice with.
Right.
Yeah,
there's a
I mean,
whole
I have
lot
my
of
own
issues.
stuff too.
He's got campers, motorcycles, all
Right.
kinds of stuff laying
She's like,
around that
really,
place.
Chuck? Another motorcycle, more antennas. So we solid. The pre-cut wire was great for a start, but it's just way easier for us to just ship you a whole roll of
And-
wire. So
yeah,
the
more
pre-cut
than-
leg
more
ain't
than
gonna
a-
work.
More than a pre-cut wire, what we do is give you a preset measurement, like we did with the Mercury. It'll get you in the ballpark, basically. I think. Is how
But
we
yeah,
do it.
even with pre-cut,
I'll do the
measurements,
work.
some people don't get that right either, right? I'm saying it with love, right? Because it's people's first time at the rodeo. Sometimes things don't work out according to plan.
I built
So-
stuff for my hex beam, and I remeasured it the other day, and I don't know if the wire or the paracord I used shrunk or what. Because everything was a touch
Totally
short.
Paracord shrunk.
It was in the pool.
I could
It was in the
see
pool
if
and it
I
drank
did
up.
one wrong, but there was multiple ones. So I think
Was there brown
it
liquor
shrunk.
involved, son?
No, not when I built.
So Ron, I will do a POTA video as soon as Ape and I are together and can do a POTA video together. So that's the answer to when that's going to happen.
Hey, I made a
So-
POTA contact when we were in Florida.
I make POTA
And even
contacts
2
every
times
weekend.
a year, two possibilities per year.
Yeah, well, right
Right.
now,
Either-
one possibility for this year, and it already passed.
Hamcation or Huntsville Hamfest. That's
Yeah.
what's going to happen.
Huntsville
don't
would
think-
be about the only time that's going to happen.
And that's only
And-
because the radio's already set up and Jim's got a cooler full of Diet Dr. Pepper in his truck.
And their
cigarettes.
shade. And their
And we're
shade. Right?
outside in the shade. That's right.
There you go. 45 is
Yeah.
a great idea.
Buy ref taking the winter does a POTA with Jim. Yeah.
We'll bring us
Mm.
flex.
Yeah.
You get to
yeah.
POTA on the flex.
Yeah, Lab Cat, that's exactly right. I've cut this thing 3 times. It's still too short.
It happens. And then here we go. Met many people who cannot read a tape measure.
Yes, that's a true statement.
You know what a common mistake is? Read upside down. Don't ask me how I know.
Right. Well, I need my splaining glasses to read the tape measure these days.
Shit,
Yeah,
I marked that an inch
amen.
wrong.
You're an inch off in the wrong direction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. All right.
Yeah,
I think that's going to
did
do it.
make
Unless
photo
there's
contacts at at Hamcation. I walked around and made a 2-meter one with somebody, T.O. or Mike or
somebody handed me a HT and I did it.
yeah, and they did it. So it's happened already. You just missed the video. Sorry.
Yeah, missed it. Or nobody got it.
So I guess what we're saying now is unless there's any more questions, I think we're gonna shut her down.
Sounds
Great.
good.
Well, thanks
show.
for being here, guys. Much appreciated.
work.
Thank you to everybody in the
everyone.
chat, and thanks to everybody who has watched. And you can ask questions at a later date in the comment section.
All right.
Much appreciated.
Later, babe.